So first we have Representative Ryan Winkler. Representative Winkler is currently serving his 4th term representing constituents in District 46A. He holds a BA in History from Harvard University and a JD from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Welcome very much, Representative. We also have Dane Smith, the President of Growth and Justice. Dane Smith was named President of Growth and Justice in April of 2007 after concluding a 30-year career as a journalist for the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press. Tax fairness and the issues surrounding government's proper role in society are issues of particular interest to Dane in areas in which he has expertise as well. He holds a degree in journalism from the University of St. Thomas and an AA degree from Inver Hills Community College. Thank you very much for being here, Dane. Thank you. Next we have Dan McElroy, President and CEO of the Hospitality Minnesota. Dan McElroy came to Hospitality Minnesota in 2011 from state government, where he served as Commissioner of Employment and Economic Development. He served as Governor Palente's Chief of Staff and Commissioner of Finance. He's an elected official in the city of Burnsville from 1983 to 1995 and in the Minnesota House of Representatives from 1995 to 2003. Thank you very much for being here. And finally, we have a face very familiar to TwinWest, Bruce Newstead, the president of the Minnesota Retailers Association. Bruce joined the Minnesota Retailers as its staff president in September of 2012, bringing with him a strong background of working with the business community, most recently serving as president and CEO of TwinWest Chamber of Commerce. He holds a master's in public administration from Minnesota State University and a BA in public policy from Concordia University in St. Paul. So thank you very much for being here as well, Bruce. Fabulous. Okay, so I have a couple of softballs I'm going to throw up, and we're going to see where this goes. I think that this is an issue that obviously is I feel very far away from you gentlemen, but that's okay. You can hear me, I'm sure. But this issue is a very challenging issue. It strikes the individuals who are impacted by this, businesses, and the effect of this. So obviously this is a very serious policy issue, and I think many things that we do in Minnesota taking a very thoughtful approach, and I appreciate you being here with us this morning so we can continue that discussion. So we're going to start on this first one, Representative Winkler, we'll start with you, and let's just put it out there and let's get the position on what do you feel, what is the right minimum wage, where do you think that should be and why?
If you don't mind, I'll start with the second part of the question first.
Sure.
Minnesota's economy is growing. Unemployment is relatively low, especially compared to the rest of the nation. We are one of the top 5 success stories from 2013 in terms of economic growth. Yet at the same time, there are huge differences in who's doing well in the state and who is not. If you look statewide and have a family of 4 making a basic budget, so food, clothing, shelter, transportation, child care, health care, no vacations, no savings, no extra fun whatsoever. 2 parents working full-time both need to make $14 an hour in order to have a basic family budget. So 2 parents, $14 an hour. 40% of the jobs in Minnesota pay less than that. If you change that and look at the number of families where you have a single person heading the household, something like 60% of the jobs pay less than what it takes one person to take care of 2 kids. If you look at what has happened through this recession, middle-class jobs have disappeared. The share of jobs that are being held, that are created in restaurants and retail has risen considerably through this recession. And if you look at people on public assistance in Minnesota, people who are qualifying for food stamps, for child care assistance, for Medicaid, 80% of those people are currently working or worked within the last 3 months. And of that 80% who work and qualify for public assistance, the majority of them are in retail, restaurants, and the temp industry. If you look at the future of job creation in Minnesota, the strongest growing areas are going to be in personal care and the low end of the healthcare assistance type jobs. So and currently the predominant jobs in our economy numbers-wise are retail, restaurants, and the temp job industry. So if you look at where we have a lot of jobs now and where we're growing in the future, we're going to see more and more Minnesotans working and fewer of them able to live on their own, support themselves through their own work, and depend on government. So if you look at that survey, which I guess is gone now,
We can bring that back up.
if that's typical, which, it's hard to say, but if you look at that survey, all of the businesses that are not employing people in low wages are paying the taxes, are paying their workers who are paying the taxes, who are supporting public programs to support other business models where people are working and qualifying for those type of programs. So we have a real need for change in how our economy works. We have a big local service economy that is growing, is going to be bigger than ever, and unless we start to and we can educate, that's important, we can innovate, we can be high tech, we can do all the wonderful things that we believe in are really important for the future of our economy. That won't do much for the 30 to 40% of people who are going to be in these other kind of jobs in the state. And unless we do policies like raising the minimum wage, which the author in the House, it's not going to solve that problem entirely, but it starts to move it in the right direction. So I think raising the minimum wage to $9.50, having a cost of living adjustment annually capped at 2.5%, which is what the House bill does, is a good start towards making 30 to 40% of the jobs in Minnesota move in the direction of being able to support people who work. And I think that's not just an economic case, and we'll debate that, but it's also a values case. We believe that I believe, and I think most people believe, that you should have the dignity of being able to support yourself through work. And that's something that I think our economy can afford to provide.
Same question. Yes, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I really appreciate this audience. It's what the TwinWest Chamber and Growth and Justice have found a lot of common ground over the years. Growth and Justice was actually founded by a former CEO and publisher of the Star Tribune, which is a large business, used to be larger. And Joel Kramer, the founder of the Star Tribune, and myself have always led this organization with a view towards finding common ground between business interests and progressives and social justice advocates for practical solutions that advance both economic justice and business growth. It seems like a sweet spot, classic Minnesota frame of mind there. And the last time I was here was to commend you for the positions that the TwinWest Chamber took on transportation investment in opposition to the constitutional amendments that would have required a supermajority for revenue increases. The minimum wage has never been at the top of our agenda. We prioritized early education in particular, education writ big, early childhood through much improved workforce training, post-secondary completion, physical infrastructure investment, and particularly transportation. This year is different. We do support a substantial increase, and although the exact amount in the end is always an arbitrary figure, we support the $9.50. For $8.50 for small business and $9.50 for larger business. And there's a reason for the strong consensus around this and the relatively, in my view, relatively lighter opposition from business interests. And here's why we've evolved on this. Last fall, we published a major report on widening inequality in Minnesota, and it was not pretty. The report showed how Minnesota's median income was lagging, how the Gini coefficient, which is this economic measurement that keeps track of total inequality, was marching upward in Minnesota. And inequality at some point, and we believe that point has been passed, is bad for business. Declining or stagnating incomes at the bottom and middle eventually begin to reduce personal consumption and the aggregate demand for the goods and services that our local businesses sell. And this report by a Carlson School professor and an economist at the University of Minnesota made the point that is often made, that low-income households spend nearly all their increases on consumption, while middle-income households spend most of that increase. And we do have an inequality crisis in the United States, and although it's not as severe in Minnesota, there's wide agreement that we need to close this, we need to reduce inequality. The other major reason we support it is essentially a conservative argument around sustaining our sacred Minnesota work ethic. A higher minimum wage is a real incentive to look for work and keep a job. The bigger the difference between the money you get for working and the money you get from entitlements, the more likely it is that low-income people will seek work and avoid seeking various forms of welfare and taxpayer-supported subsidies. Most of the social justice advocates say a very business-oriented thing. They say that the best welfare program is a good paying job. So there's a huge amount of information and literature out there about how low-wage employers are actively encouraging their employees to seek government benefits. I encourage you to take a look at that. That's just wrong-headed. And one final point, race equity and gender equity are hugely important factors too. We're pushing 30 to 40% enrollment in our schools for kids of color. Their families are struggling. If we don't close these gaps, our economy will not thrive for our children and grandchildren. I think there's overwhelming support for the legislation. Glad to hear every member who stood up here of the legislature support some increase. So we really do need to work on addressing these gaps, and we believe that compromise likely will happen, and we support the common ground that might be reached between the Senate and the House.
Thank you. So Dan, you've heard our first two panelists here agreeing to $9.50. So where's the hospitality?
Well, our members understand the minimum wage will go up. We are not opposed to a reasonable increase. We think $9.50 is aggressive. It would leave us with, right at now, having the second highest minimum wage on the books after California. That'll change after this legislative session. Still dramatically higher than the states around us. South Dakota has a ballot referendum coming up in November at $8.50. Star Tribune has opined that $8.50 is more reasonable. Although I agree with Dane, there's support. The Star Tribune report last month showed considerable questions among respondents about $9.50. So the overall level we worry about the impact on tipped employees. Representative Loon alluded to the situation in Washington and Oregon, where since their minimum wage has been going up dramatically, the number of employees per restaurant has declined very significantly, largely through automation of some functions, doing away with positions like busboys and hosts and hostesses, reconcepting to counter ordering. If Washington and Oregon had the same number of employees per restaurant today that they had before their minimum wage went up, they'd have 50,000 more jobs. Their prices on general, we pulled menus from about a dozen chains that do business here and in Oregon. Their Oregon prices are about 20% higher than they are here. So the minimum wage increase is not free. It is paid for by our employees in the form of fewer hours and fewer job opportunities, by our guests in the form of higher prices, and by our communities in the form of reduced community involvement, fewer opportunities in the community, less investment in capital investment and new facilities, less growth, at least in the full service segment. My members are good business people. They will adjust. But the adjustments will mean that kind of this culture of sit-down dining, really good paying tipped jobs probably will change. We don't think that's a good idea. Secondly, we are strongly opposed to putting the minimum wage on autopilot. Interestingly, both the Star Tribune with its progressive tradition and the Pioneer Press have also written editorials expressing concern with that. We applaud the Senate position that that's not a great idea. Third, we're concerned about the impact on young people. The minimum wage was originally set up as a beginner's wage and not a kind of household wage. Representative Winkler's correct that our unemployment rate for the whole population is low. Our unemployment for 16 to 19 and 16 to 24-year-olds is not. It's about over 11%. Nationally, youth unemployment rates are challenging. We like the Senate position that would keep a $7.25 youth wage for those not yet 18. Young people can't do as much in the workplace. They can't work the same hours. They can't use the same equipment. So having a youth wage, we think, makes a lot of sense. Our proposal to protect tipped employees is to create a tipped employee tier of the minimum wage. Minnesota is one of only 7 states that don't allow the federal tip credit. We've gone away from our support of that because it would cut people's wages, which we don't think is the Minnesota way. The tipped employee tier would keep people at $7.25 an hour. if they make $12 an hour or more with their tips and wages. We did a broad survey of full-service restaurants last year, and the average tipped employee statewide made over $18 an hour. Protecting those jobs and not having them replaced with iPads or food runners strikes us as a good idea. We would also like to see, perhaps not in this bill, but that the legislature take action so that we have one state and one rate for the minimum wage. There's a rally in Minneapolis tomorrow calling for a Minneapolis city wage of $15 an hour. In states like California and New Mexico, where they have city wages, it has been disruptive. We don't think that's a good idea. We hope that won't happen.
So, Dan, thank you. I think you've answered all of my questions that I have. No, thank you. We'll come back and we'll go into more detail on them. So Bruce, if you could, let's focus on, so your organization, what are you representing as far as what you think a fair minimum wage should be and why is that your?
It's a great question, and thanks for having me here today. It's great to be back at TwinWest. Congratulations to the staff. This looks like NASCAR up here. This is fantastic. So congratulations to you. But it shows great support in the business community for learning about issues, digesting them, and reacting to them. So I think that is the magic of TwinWest there. So congratulations. And I want to thank our legislators, too, because this is actually a very difficult topic generally. But when I look at it, I tend not to pit it as the rich against the poor, those that have versus have-nots. I tend to look at it a little bit more of a lemonade stands economic approach. And so my organization, I'll just tell you right up front, $9.50 is kind of high. So we like to call that a dramatic increase. And we get concerned about a dramatic increase when you add the word quick to it, which means you don't phase it in over a long period of time. And when you let it just kind of keep going and you add the inflator. But we'll get back to those things. So my organization has concerns about the $9.50, but shares Dan's organization's thoughts that we know the wage is going to go up. Sometimes right now it's a little embarrassing actually to say Minnesota's minimum is below the federal. That doesn't make us feel good as Minnesotans, so having this conversation is good. And I just think we think there's somewhere in there in a middle point. But I'm not going to advocate much for that middle point today because quite frankly I think that conversation has been had. The House has decided $9.50, and the Senate recently in negotiations, the conference committee said $9.50. So I'm sort of operating from the standpoint that $9.50 is our number. So the comments I'll have today will focus a little bit about how do we work within that number that makes it a little bit more comfortable for businesses. But keep in mind, from a lemonade stand economics perspective, there's some basic things at play here. Most of you in the room here have budgets for payroll for next year. And because of competitive market forces and the markets in which we work, you're going to keep your prices somewhat similar to where they are today. That's just a product of living in America and competing. And I think when we get to this kind of $9.50 level and we start to be, in Senator Bach's words, an outlier, one of the top fives in minimum wage, one, that doesn't make people think, hey, I want to move to Minnesota because there's some great policies there that help my business grow. So $9.50 is a perception problem for Minnesota, but it's also a competitive problem when you look at Iowa, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, et cetera. So $9.50 is a little high. I do like the Star Tribune poll that I think has been referenced a couple times here. And depending on how you look at it, you could either look at it and say the majority of Minnesotans support $9.50, but when I looked at the numbers, it looked like a majority of the Minnesotans supported either the state minimum right now or something between the state minimum and $9.50. Now, I happen to like something in between because that's about $7.82. But that's probably not a realistic number for legislators, quite frankly. So I think we'll talk more about some of the other parameters around it, but today I'm not here really to fight $9.50 because I think $9.50 is a decided deal. So if you're doing your plans for next year and the year after, start thinking about those numbers. But what we can talk today about is how we maybe mitigate that or help businesses phase to that.
Thank you. So the automatic inflator, we've heard a little bit, some of you touched on it. We also heard Representative Loon talk about the instability, the lack of predictability for businesses on tying something to an automatic inflator. So Dan, let's start with you. Your thoughts on the automatic inflator. Should it be included? Yep. Should it not be included? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, we do support the inflator, and I think it's an exceedingly modest cost of living adjustment. It's what, CPI inflation or 2.5%, whichever is less. And if inflation ever gets to be a problem again, and it hasn't been really a problem in our economy for some 20 years, this provision, again, if inflation took off, would actually keep low-wage inflation to 2.5%. So it would actually erode the minimum wage if inflation got to be a problem. One somewhat amusing aside is that lobbyists and special interests probably wouldn't like it because it's less to fight over year after year. You'll probably save some money in lobbying expenses. And I've actually heard muttering from labor leaders that it's not having a minimum wage to fight for jobs robs them of an important political tool. Not having an adjustment means that the wage would be frozen. That's an automatic tool. That's it's often described as autopilot. The critics of the inflator call it autopilot. Well, not having it is an autopilot at the frozen level, and not having an automatic adjustment has meant, in my history as a political reporter, I've seen the wage frozen for 10-year periods through the 80s and then through the 2000s. And incidentally, in the 90s when it went up, that was one of the best decades for Minnesota economically. And one of the reasons why we have the dramatic sticker shock from this increase is the long period of frozenness. And so if you want to avoid that shock, sticker shock, and the drama in future years, then an inflator makes sense.
Dan, why don't we go to you? We'll just...
All right. First of all, I've been up at the Capitol a lot lately, and I'm not convinced that there are enough votes for 950, particularly in greater Minnesota and in border communities. It only takes 6 senators to say we can't do that on the DFL side to keep that from happening. We're also hearing nervous House members who say that may be too much, so I don't come to the conclusion you do. We have concerns about the autopilot. The legislature meets every year. They should evaluate this, and I agree with Dane, waiting a decade isn't a good idea. We've been supportive of a biannual or triannual report from the Department of Labor about the minimum wage. The UK has a system now where they have a low-wage commission, including economists, labor, and business, that recommends the minimum wage on an annual basis. They also have a system to account for youth, where the minimum wage commission recommends an adult wage. 18 and 19-year-olds work at 80%, 16 and 17-year-olds work at 60%, and it's helped them with the youth unemployment problem. So we think a thoughtful approach is helpful. More frequent legislative review is not a bad idea. We agree, well, you can quote me on this, we agree with the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press that putting the wage on, but they have a traditional progressive bias, and so the fact that they, along with many other newspapers and others, don't support the inflator, we think is telling. We don't think the inflator is a good idea.
And we'll go to Bruce then on that. So what impact would that inflator have on those you represent?
Yeah, again, I think we can debate the legislative arguments. There's good thought that those people in the room have been elected to make good decisions on behalf of the people of Minnesota every year, and an inflator sort of takes that decision out of the hands of good legislators. So a little bit of an objection there, but from the business side, although capped at 2.5%, I still think there's a problem with saying, you know what, let's face it, we're going to have some growth over the next few years, thankfully so. And that growth is going to include 2.5% each year, hopefully for the next 5, 6, 7 years, depending on what economic projections you look at. So you're going to know you're going to have some growth. And I think whether it's the inflator, the wage level, whatever provisions, I think one of the things we missed in the conversation is the fact that really the best decisions about wages and pay are between an employer and an employee, or an employer and a collective bargaining unit. So I think a lot of times we'll see the results of today's poll at some point, and you'll find that a lot of people don't pay minimum wage, and that's because the market pushes us above that. But anyway, I get a little away from the inflator. So the inflator bothers us because I always hesitate to say this because I feel like it sounds disrespectful, and I don't mean it, Representative Winkler, but you know, if the inflator is such a great idea, why do we need to cap the damages on that at 2.5%? And I say that tongue-in-cheek because I know he has offered that as a way to provide some predictability. So thank you for that. But just in general, I think an inflator is just not a great idea, and not a great way to run public policy. It's not a great way to help businesses plan for the future and look at what their future wage costs will be. So I think there's some big problems from that perspective. You always see the inflator going up. You'll never see it go down, right? There's not a provision in the bill that says if there's deflation and we hit another 2008, we're going to bring wages back down. It's always going to stay at where that was and keep working its way back up. So I think there's some kind of fundamental policy problems and some business issues with it as well.
Representative Winkler, do you want to respond to same question on the
Sure.
inflator,
Yeah,
and why is...
I mean, there's a lot of things I'd like to respond to, but I'll try to respect your
You
question
know,
as much as I can.
You can go off a little, I don't pull the chain too hard.
Just to be clear about what is contained in the current bill and what's being negotiated right now, 950 is for large businesses fully phased in by the end of 2016. So we're not talking about going from 725 to 950 this year. It is phased in over time. The inflator kicks in thereafter for annual adjustments capped at 2.5%. We've gone through a kind of long presentation and analysis of all the different minimum wages we have in Minnesota right now. So right now, in Minnesota, a small business is anything with $625,000 in sales or less. The federal number is $500,000. So one of the things we'd like to do is align with the federal number of $500,000 so that when we don't end up with a small employer, a large employer, a small employer that meets the federal definition and an employee that's in interstate commerce or not, a large employer based on a Minnesota definition that is a higher number, a youth wage. I think we ended up, when we looked at all of the things that were in the Senate proposal, there were 6 different state minimum wages. And so one of the important things we're looking at is trying to maintain simplicity so that it's easier for employers to know what they're supposed to be paying employees. And of the thousands and thousands of complaints or questions or requests that the State Department of Labor and Industry gets every year from employees and employers about various workplace issues, well over half of them are about how much they're supposed to pay in the minimum wage. So I think that as we're looking at these various proposals that people are bringing forward, I'm open to all those things. But simplicity is a good value to have in determining what the state minimum wage should be. As to the inflator, if you adjusted back from 1968 forward in the federal minimum wage, it would be at about $10.75 an hour right now. When Minnesota first passed a state minimum wage in 1973, and before that we had some sort of council or the Commissioner of Labor or somebody who set it on their own, but we first had a statutory minimum wage in Minnesota in the early 70s, adjusting that for inflation forward, and it's about $9.44 an hour. So what we're talking about right now of moving up to $9.50 over several years is actually well within the historic norm of a minimum wage, both in Minnesota and nationally. And the fact that other states are letting theirs drop, the fact that the federal government hasn't raised theirs for 7 years, we haven't done it for 9 years, is an indicator of what's really happening, which is that inaction in politics is leading to an erosion in the buying power of the minimum wage over time. That has been its history for 80 years, since 1938. And that's why I think an inflator is such a good idea, because not only does it help those workers whose costs go up every year. I mean, in this discussion, we should not forget that the people who are making those wages are seeing their costs rise every year, and their ability to consume and support their families is affected. I spent some time looking through the financials 2 days ago of a restaurant in central Minnesota. And I think the total cost of a minimum wage increase would be about a 2% increase over 3 years in their total overhead. So cost of sales and all of their expenses. If you look at the other things they're buying, whether it's food supplies, alcohol, soda, all the other things are also going up. And so that begs the question, why should labor be the only thing that doesn't go up with inflation every year, just like every other business expense does? And in fact, that very question was raised by a Minneapolis restaurant owner in our conference committee. Everything else goes up. Why should labor be the only thing that doesn't? And so both from the worker perspective, from the financial perspective of business that deals with that inflation number, and the practicality of it. I don't imagine that it's been too predictable for any of your businesses in the last year about what's going to happen to the minimum wage. If we had stuck to an inflator, you would know that it was never going to go up by more than 2.5%, and there's nothing less predictable than what politicians are going to do in passing laws. So personally, I would, if I'm looking at my own family's financial condition, I'd rather bank on inflation than what the legislature might do from one year to the other.
Until inflation becomes kind of haywire. We haven't experienced that for a while, but yours had the cap that is on that.
The cap's at 2.5%.
So there's a lot of other elements of this bill that impact different businesses and different individuals. So let's talk about some of the provisions. So we've heard that there's the youth wage that is an issue. There's a tiered wage system. We won't call it a tip credit. aspect of that, which really, you know, I mean, a lot of, you know, that does have a significant impact, obviously, for restaurants. So, Dan, let's start with you, and if you could kind of talk about some of those different provisions. Dan, we're going to start with Dan McElroy here, and kind of where.
Well, some of them we have referred to. Our concerns are really the overall rate, and something like 50% of Minnesotans live within 50 miles of a border. A new state minimum wage would not apply to businesses on recognized tribal land. Although our tribal partners have been very responsible about their wage, they can use the federal tip credit if they choose to. So the overall rate we worry about. We battled the tipped employee tier to a tie last year in the House, 65-65, and one of the longtime sponsors was out with pneumonia. So I always think, but for a hospitalization, that might have passed. It did not get to a vote in the Senate because of a kerfuffle over an amendment that caused some confusion, but it has, I think, a fair amount of support. It is a creative compromise over the tip credit in surrounding states or over doing nothing and seeing these jobs kind of automated away. The youth wage we think is very important. We applaud the Senate provision. We hope that stays in the final bill. The inflator, you know, I'm worried that if we had an inflator, then the least well-performing person on a business team would be absolutely assured of a 2.5% increase, even if they weren't a particularly good worker. And I worry about the likelihood of raises being dependent not on how hard someone works or how good they are at their jobs or how creative or how much they get better each year, but rather on the action of an index or the legislature. Interestingly, in talking to my counterparts who run restaurant lodging associations around the country, having it indexed doesn't take it off the political debate because there are constantly bills being introduced to modify the index, accept the index, clarify the index, and so the debate will change from what should the minimum wage be to how does the autopilot work, but it doesn't take it off the radar range. We also hope that this issue of one state, one rate gets some attention at the legislature so we don't end up with a balkanized minimum wage the way they have in a few cities in California and New Mexico.
So, Bruce, the various provisions and anyone that you wanted that
Sure.
Really impact your.
Yeah, there's probably four things that, and I should apologize, Dan, I didn't mean to make it sound like everybody should just accept the 950. Do what you can to bring some reasonableness to that number, no doubt about it. But that does to be the negotiated number. So if you're going to spend some time on this issue, and you're not going to spend time at 950 because you might pay above that already, frankly, et cetera. We've got some great economic activity here in the western suburbs. Quite frankly, the economy here is a little different than Thief River Falls and some other areas, so we should keep that in mind when we look at some of these things. Number one would be the inflator, just keeping that out of the mix. That's really important. Number two would be, it's been mentioned, youth wages. You know, we want to keep a strong, when I think of, sometimes people classify retail jobs as low-paying jobs, and oftentimes I call them, those are entry-level jobs. You know, my first job was in beautiful Winona, Minnesota on the banks of the Mississippi, working for Bridgman, scooping raspberry fudge tort ice cream. And that's where I learned you got to show up on time and all the skills that you need to learn. So a lot of times we need to think of retail jobs, some of the jobs as entry-level, first jobs, first work experience jobs. So for that, we need to make sure that we have some type of youth structure in the bill that allows for some type of incentive or ability to keep youth active. If you have to pay $9.50 and you have a 40-year-old in your community that will take $9.50 and you have a 16-year-old that will take $9.50, you're probably going to employ the 40-year-old because they have more experience, right? So we need to have some provisions for the youth side of it. And then the third thing that I think is really important is that phase-in period. If we're going to look at a dramatic increase, we should allow people to adjust to it. And from my perspective, somewhere in the area of a 3-year phase, and then you hit some of the other provisions is really important. So I think when you talk about this with legislators, not only ask them to keep the inflator out, but think about a reasonable but longer period of time to move to a number that you can always spend some time adjusting to.
So, Representative Winkler, how would you, let me just kind of maybe specify some questions. I think those who own restaurants are very concerned, you know, particularly not your chain, but your kind of small, well, the chains I'm sure are as well, but your smaller restaurants, and we've got a couple of members here in TwinWest, that not looking at the tipped employees any differently and the impact to that. What is the rationale for kind of standing the ground on that, not having that offset, if you will?
Well, first of all, one of the best rationales in my mind is that the median wage for servers in Minnesota is $8.68 an hour. So we're not talking about across the employee occupation categories. It includes the tips. That's not just the hourly wage. That includes the tips. And it includes some non-tipped employees as well. But in general, it's in an industry that has very low wages. And you may cite a particular hourly figure for a particular employee, but that does not mean that that translates into 40 hours a week throughout a whole year. We're talking part-time jobs. So a few people may make higher percentages or higher hourly rates, but it's not like that necessarily translates to an annual income that's above poverty. And if you, again, go back and look at people who qualify for public assistance, a majority of them are in retail and restaurants. That does not indicate an industry that's paying a lot of people $20 an hour. And in fact, you know, there are a lot of people who are depending on these types of jobs, more so than ever before. But the issue is not just, the job growth is going to be there because there is a strong demand in the local economy for restaurants. If you go to Seattle and Portland, they have thriving restaurant scenes. There's no question about that. The number came up about the jobs that would have been there but for the minimum wage change. I just looked it up. I grabbed my phone and looked it up. I searched minimum wage jobs, restaurants, Washington State, and the first article that came up was from Bloomberg that said payrolls had gone up 21% since they raised their minimum wage in 1998 to one of the highest levels in the country and inflated it. So in general, I just think the picture of a bunch of these servers around the state making lots of money in these jobs and they're going to have to go away just doesn't bear out when you look at the industry as a whole and when you look at all the jobs in aggregate. This is a low-wage industry, and more people who used to be able to get better paying jobs and because of changes in the economy are now relying on these jobs. More and more people are counting on them. More and more families are relying on them, and we have to start to move more of the local service jobs into a better paying position and higher quality. Otherwise, more and more people are going to slip farther and farther behind.
So Dane, go ahead and talk about some of the provisions, but Dan, I know you really want to respond to Representative Winkler here. So we're, I could sense it. So Dane, why don't you go ahead and talk about kind of where growth and justice is on a couple of these issues, and then Dan, we're going to let you respond to that on the hospitality issue.
Some sort of adjudication of the difference between $18 an hour and $8 over here. So I have a conflict of interest here. My daughter works for a large retailer in Bloomington, and my son worked for many years, several years, as a server at a mid-level restaurant in the airport. And thankfully, I finally got him on a different career. It's pretty clear to him and to all of us who love him that he was not going to actually have a good middle-class life as a server at a restaurant. We do not see a compelling reason to provide this dramatically lower or considerably lower minimum wage for either youth or tipped employees. We're seeing actually more and more youth are contributing to the welfare and the survival of their low-income families. The youth need this higher level of income as much as their minimum wage working parents, and we just think that there's you know the anecdotes that suggest that there might be a few well-paid servers at fancy restaurants is just not enough for changing a statewide policy that could reduce the income for low-income people. You know, back to my son, one time he got one gigantic tip. There's this weird thing going out there. Mystery tippers, I don't know if it's guilty rich people or something, but they just shower hundreds and hundreds of dollars of tips on employees. Check it out on the internet. It's kind of interesting. But again, he was not doing well in a job as a server. And so again, this is kind of a conflict of interest here. I'm witnessing firsthand how much my daughter makes at her job, and I can't wait for them to get their college degrees and their credentials so they can move into higher paying jobs. That's where we need to focus our energy, not on this minimum wage level. Let's settle it and get on.
Dan, I'm going to have you respond to Representative Winkler there and the issue that you...
Well, the number Representative Winkler uses comes from the quarterly census of employment and wages done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics with a much broader definition that includes some counter team. If that number is correct, our proposal to have a threshold of $12 an hour would be such those people would get the new minimum wage. That's why we think our tipped employee tier is a creative solution. And Dane, it isn't just a few people at fancy restaurants. This Department of Labor and Industry did a study and has done one a couple of times recently, showing that there were 82,000 Minnesotans that worked at $7.25 or less. A significant number of those, about 38,000, worked at eating and drinking establishments. We know from surveying our members that the vast majority of those who work at the minimum wage also get tips. The survey we did was broadly responded to. I have since had a chance to go beyond that and verify that number, about $18 an hour statewide and $22 in the metro area, with literally hundreds of restaurant operators. I know some of them have literally brought in their payroll to meetings with Representative Winkler, and he's been kind enough to look at them. It's not isolated. The number in Washington, Representative Winkler is correct. There are plenty of restaurant jobs. They simply don't pay as well as they used to. And the number of jobs per restaurant has declined in Washington and Oregon from in the high 15 towards 16 number to about 13.8, where in Minnesota it stayed closer to that 16.5 number, largely because of different concepts. Fastest growing concepts are places where we don't have the good paying tipped jobs, and increased use of automation. Some of that will happen anyway. It's happened faster in high wage states. So we think fighting for those good paying jobs that are tipped servers and bartenders and pizza delivery drivers is good public policy. We will continue to make that fight.
Let's do, and maybe we can do this as kind of more lightning round a little quick, but would love to hear from any questions that we have in our audience here. Anybody have a question that they would like to ask? Greg?
Don't mind, but you don't need one because I'm a loud guy.
You are.
I've heard a lot of conversation about need on behalf of the workers, and I'm empathetic with the need on behalf of minimum wage workers. But the one thing I haven't heard in the conversation is value. What are we doing with this kind of public policy statement about increasing the ability to provide value of the minimum wage workers so that we as business people who are used to making decisions on the basis of what's the value to the business, what's the value we provide to our enterprise, can really accept a minimum wage increase.
Who wants to start with that? Doesn't sound like a really quick response.
Well, I'll jump in
question,
quickly.
but it was a good question.
First of all, I think most employers, when they look at what they need to pay employees, tend to look at what comparable employees make around their industry. So I'm not sure that they do sort of an in-depth analysis of the value of that one employee. They look at the demand that they have, right, and what the needs are to serve their customers, and they look at what they have to pay in the market in order to get that work in-house to get it done, and whether that makes sense for them. So I don't know that we see a lot of that kind of analysis. But if you look kind of economy-wide, from about World War II until the early 1970s, wages and the minimum wage rose perfectly with productivity. As productivity rose, wages and the minimum wage went up hand in glove. Since the early 1970s, there's been a big divide. Productivity has continued to climb in the United States, and again, these are macro numbers. It's not exactly the kind of business question you're talking about, but it's a macro number. Productivity has continued to rise, and wages and the minimum wage have dropped off and have flattened out entirely from the 1970s until today. So there has been a change in how this works. It used to be a rising tide lifted all boats. That was true from World War II through the 1960s into the 1970s. It was also briefly true during the 1990s when the economy was so strong that wages were rising, poverty was falling, and things were working for almost all Americans. That has not been true since 2000, and it was not true through the late 70s and 1980s. So there has been a disconnect between productivity and the reward that employees are getting in wages. And if you look nationally, profitability is very high. Corporate profitability nationally is very high. Wages are at their lowest share of GDP since the early 1950s. So we are just not seeing employees getting the share of productivity that they're generating.
I would agree on those macro numbers. Productivity is driven in part by technology, so it's not necessarily that employers are all that much more virtuous or harder working, but the technology with which they work has made them more productive. So that has to be figured into it. But there's some interesting studies that show, and there's sort of an intuitive knowledge among business leaders that if you pay employees more, they will be more productive. They take their jobs more seriously. They're less likely to leave. Turnover's reduced. There are some cost savings and some value to paying people more. This has been part of American business lore since Henry Ford paid his employees enough to actually buy the car they were producing, and it created quite a stir among his fellow capitalists who thought he was crazy, but he explained it just that way, that paying his employees more would actually make them better employees. So these are factors that are seldom discussed in the questions of value and of labor costs.
So we just have 2 minutes here, but Bruce or Dan? Either, both?
Let Bruce take this one.
Okay.
Just real quick, Greg, your question was really about skills and what employees bring to the table, and you have to think about this a little historically. Back in the time when we ran a manufacturing or agriculture-based economy, workforce was a little bit of a commodity, right? You had hands, you had a job, those hands did those jobs. Well, today's jobs require employers to take a look at skills, backgrounds, experiences, et cetera. So the metrics are a little bit different today, and you're right, an employer looks at an applicant and says, okay, what do they bring to the table? What are their skill sets? What do I need to train them on to get them ready for the job today, and what do they already know? And gone are the days where the commodity was everybody knew X, Y, or Z, and you knew you had to train everybody the same. Today, when you hire somebody, you have to do a specific training for that specific job. So that has changed the economy from that perspective, and it's changed how employers look at value. I think sometimes when we look at minimum wage, and again, I like to think of it as entry-level wage, we talk too much about the minimum standard, and the minimum standard means if you raise the standard of the wage, you're going to raise the standard of the employee. And that leads us to, actually, Representative Winkle was very eloquent on it earlier. I think he said the words innovation, and he said the words workforce and education. You can't just talk about minimum wage without being its own vacuum. You can't just talk about it without talking about innovation, education, and what the quality. Now, this is the Workforce Chamber of Commerce here. I mean, you guys have worked hard in early childhood all the way through programs with colleges. So you understand that better than anybody else. But yeah, it's not just about raising a wage level. It's about what are those other things, what are those workforce components that go into an employee, and the decisions that an employer then makes on wages.
So given to our always commitment to get you guys back to work at 9 o'clock, I'm going to cut the conversation here, but I really want to thank you. This has been a great conversation, and I appreciate you being here and bringing your perspectives. Just really quickly, I want to remind folks, so thank you, please. Thank you so much for doing this. Just quickly, a couple things. Please, next Wednesday is Business Day at the Capitol. So you folks who lobby, come lobby more. Those who say you never do, come join us at Business Day at the Capitol. So we'll be joining businesses from across the state to lobby legislators on issues critical to business. Check the website or ask any of the staff here about it. It's really a fun, engaging day. We're also accepting applications for Entrepreneur of the Year. So contact Travis Brown at TwinWest or see our website for the nomination forms, which is a really fun, exciting to be able to showcase some of our members here. And then again, special thanks to Grand Casino, Mille Lacs, and Hinckley for being our series sponsor, as always, all of our sponsors. And that is it. Have a fabulous day and an even better weekend. Thanks, everybody.